What we crave is like actually connection. It's a very human thing. Like we don't crave answers. Ultimately, we don't crave answers. We crave connection.
Welcome to Permission Slips, a space to practice paying attention to your life with self-compassion so you can experience the wholeness, purpose, and joy you were made for. I'm Jillian DeBritz, a life and leadership coach and a recovering perfectionist, learning alongside you how to give myself permission to be human. I'm so glad you're here with me for this conversation with my friend, Bryan Halferty. Bryan, I'm so glad you're here.
So good to be here. Thanks, Julian.
Bryan is the lead pastor of Anchor Church in Tacoma, Washington, which is a community of imperfect Jesus followers with a growing number of congregations around Washington's South Sound. Bryan is also a dear friend of mine, and his wife, Candice, is one of my very best friends. So it's extra fun to have him here. Bryan is just about to release his first book called Terrible Beauty, which is a memoir that explores how life's most challenging moments, failure, fear, and uncertainty, can become unexpected pathways to grace and transformation. With poetic insight and raw honesty, Bryan invites readers to embrace the risks of faith, where beauty is found not in perfection, but in the messy, redemptive work of community and trust in God. And this is rooted in his own experiences planting a church and facing personal and marital crises. Terrible Beauty is a meditation on grace, resilience, and the power of vulnerability in shaping an authentic faith. Oh. Bryan, how is it to hear me read back to you a description of your work?
Sounds a little grandiose. Whoever wrote that needs to turn out some adjectives, I think.
Oh my gosh. Well, I've read your book. I read kind of the beta draft of it and then snippets of the revised final version, which is such a joy because this has been a long journey for you. Talk about the process of writing a book. What's it been like?
Yeah, well, geez, yeah, you've seen the kind of the church planting journey and the writing journey, but the writing journey, I don't know. I mean, I think most people that write, I would say, have something in them that they just want to create. They want to explore their own thoughts. They have an interest in putting words on a page, and so that's always been a part of my story. You know that I've kind of been torn back and forth between the kind of the role of pastor and the kind of this the urge to be a writer, this kind of this kind of romantic idea of like writing or whatever. Um, yeah, but anyway, so the book, comes from this kind of urge within me, but it also the experience of planting this church, and I think it was about 2019. I did a presentation at a church planting conference, and it was how to plant a church without self-destructing, and that was the theme. And I was like just coming out of this this part of my own journey of like self-destructing, like getting pretty close,
This was fresh. This was real for you.
It was fresh. I was just out of the lab and I was ready to tell people about how they could do this. Yeah, clearly. Yes. Yeah. I was what do they say? Like I was like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I tried the medicine on myself first, So anyways, there was just a slide deck and like a 40-minute presentation, but I began sitting with that and I was like I wonder if there's a book here. And I think there's two chapters that were kind of like some blend of like storytelling and prescriptive that sat in my computer for a long time, and I think that's that's probably a lot of people that try to write a book. A lot of people that, they have two chapters. I've got two chapters, and the two chapters probably aren't that good, but there's something there, And so that was like me. And that was 2019, 2020. At a certain point, I think it was 2021, a friend of mine who was starting into this kind of coaching journey, which I know you're familiar with that journey. He was getting certified. He needed to practice have some hours or whatever. And he wanted to, spend some of that with me. And so he's just asked this question of like, what is the project you want to work on? What do you want to see? What do you like? That's just kind of sitting dormant. And it was this book project. I got two chapters. Right? And so just through this conversation, he was able to hold me accountable to my own desires, which is great to have a friend that is like, I don't think I would have I wouldn't have held myself accountable to my own desires, helping me hold myself accountable. So I started getting up at 5 a.m. I started work, right? And through the process, I I have a book. I had a book, but it was like that was like probably like a third of the way.
It's so fun for me to remember back because
Yeah,
what I didn't mention in the beginning is that I've known you, for
yeah,
15 years.
sure,
And Corey, my husband, has known you much longer. Side
yeah.
note, for anyone listening that's interested, the fun fact is that Bryan and my husband were roommates in college for, I think it was a year, right? 1 or 2 years. And so we've had a long history, and it's been pretty amazing and really beautiful to watch you and Candace take this journey,
Mm,
both as a couple becoming more fully yourselves, each
yeah,
of you
yeah,
individually and together, and also this brave, gut wrenching, faith building, ego breaking, church
yes.
planting journey, right? And I've walked pretty intimately with Candace throughout the last, has it been 8 years now? 8 years since you
It'll
moved?
be yeah, it'll be 8 in summer.
Yeah, yeah. So it's really fun for me to hear the writing piece of it. As you also know, I'm in my own book writing journey and have two
Yeah.
chapters, Bryan. I literally have two
Yes!
chapters.
Come on!
So I'm feeling this like little twinge of courage starting to fire
Yeah,
up, even hearing you talk about
come
that
on.
process. Yeah. So how did you, when you started working with this coach, which also thanks for the plug for coaching, love that. You started working with this coach, and how did those two chapters morph into, well, no, so you wrote the book. So how did
Yeah.
that then develop?
Yeah, so I had this book that I I think like what I thought was that anybody that's going to buy a book on church planning already niche, right? It's already niche. It has to be super practical, and so that was kind of like I didn't want to write a practical book. Like the idea of like I wanted to write a creative. I wanted to be literary. I wanted to be personal. But I'm like, oh, if it's going to sell, so it's this practical weird mashup shoehorn thing of practical and personal. And I was able to get an agent. We started shopping it. Nobody wanted to buy the book. No publisher wanted to buy the book. And I had one call with one guy, and he was like, hey, I feel like the story is kind of like on the backstage, but like it feels like it wants to be on the front. And so, your show's permission slips. He gave me this permission slip. And I think with every permission slip, there's like a permission to do something, but you have to flip and you have to be courageous. You have to do it. Because he was
Yeah.
like, you should just rewrite the whole thing. You should just redo the whole thing. Yeah, right. Yeah. So it's like hundreds of hours of me working on this. And now he's like, why don't you do it again? And so but the guy was he's respected, very respected editor. He was saying something that my heart, like, I was like, oh, that's what I want. Right. And so it's what I wanted. I respected him. His publisher didn't take the book, but I rewrote it. And I asked him afterwards, even though his publisher wasn't going to take it to be my editor and help me, and he was willing to do that. And so that was another 5 or 6 months. So this has been like a 5 year journey. And he actually wrote the forward in the final version, which it's a kind of a dear thing to have his words there. But
Yeah,
yeah,
which it's so interesting to look back and, I don't know how familiar people are with the book writing process. I sure wasn't before I entered into it myself. But to be traditionally published, writers have to write a book proposal, which is like a business
yeah,
document for how you're going to sell your book. It's actually more about how you're going to sell the book than about the content in the beginning, which is super frustrating for those of us who just want to be creative and share words with
yeah,
the world. And so then you, in theory, pitch the book proposal, get an agent who then pitches that proposal to a publisher who then says, yes, write the book. We'll pay you for it. Not very much, but we'll pay you to do this thing. And then we'll sell the book to the world. And so you went through this process. And
yeah,
I hear this like tension within you saying, okay, I want to write a book that's going to sell. Like
yeah,
I might have to just niche it down and make
yeah,
something practical. But there's this longing inside me that you mentioned your coach holding you accountable to your own desires.
yeah,
And then when that editor said,
yeah.
rewrite the whole thing, there was something about your longing in there that kind of came to the surface.
No, I mean, I think you're hitting on it. I think that it's interesting. These two people at these critical junctures, and many others, have had to say, Bryan, what do you want? Do the thing. And they've almost had to coax me in. I think this is the story of many of our lives, my life certainly, of like coaxing me to do the thing that is good and that is true and beautiful. And because we will always, I mean, I can't say we. I will say, well, what's the thing that's practical, not the thing that's beautiful? And oftentimes the thing that's beautiful is the thing that will activate you. And the thing that's practical won't even make the money that you imagine it will.
Mhm.
so,
Yeah.
so I anyway, so I interrupted you, so I don't know if there's a question here on the version, but
Well, I mean, as you're talking about paying attention to the thing that's within you that's good and beautiful and true. Like,
Yeah.
what's important about that? Why does
Yeah.
that matter as
Yeah.
opposed to doing the thing that's practical that makes sense on the
Yeah.
outside?
Well, I think that when people have asked me like what do you want from this book? Like what do you want? Like what do you want a reader to have? And what I kind of had but didn't quite have in this church planning journey was like what I would call a friend. Now I had a lot of friends, right? It's not like I was like some lonely guy. I had a lot of friends, but I didn't have like a friend who had made it through to the other side that was not in a professional relationship with me, right? So so I had people that were church planners that I had a professional relationship with, but I didn't have somebody that was like, yeah, you're at that stage where your marriage is at, and so I think what we crave, and this is why what we crave is actually this type of is like actually connection. It's a very human thing. Like we don't crave answers. Ultimately, we don't crave answers. We crave connection. And I I um I believe that's why memoirs sell. And I
Right.
believe that's why we're addicted to social media because it provides a veneer of connection. And I think that ultimately this comes down to who we are, like as in through the lens of creation. God created us for connection, and our eternity is about connection. It's not about I have the answers. And so I think that we've tricked ourselves to believing that manuals will provide what we need or hacks and steps will provide what we need, but they actually never do. They always leave us with this sense of, well, maybe there's more. Whereas connection brings resolution and resolve and actually is a foretaste of what will ultimately be. And so that's what I wanted this book to be. And that's the universal and the particular is usually what's described. So that's why a memoir expands in yourself. When you read a good memoir, it expands and you find yourself there. And you find the universal story of humanity expressed in a particular story. And so I think that's what this book is reaching for in incredibly imperfect ways. I just reread a section of it this morning, and I'm like, oh, there's a passive verb.
Yeah. Right. Which the process of writing in itself is excruciatingly vulnerable. And even as you're talking about connection versus, a program or a manual, connection is also excruciatingly vulnerable.
Yeah,
And as you said, is what we long for, what we're made for.
yeah,
And so can I read a little section from your
oh,
introduction? As you were talking
yeah,
about that, I love your description of what you're telling readers will come in the book. And this is the very end of the introduction where it says, in these pages, there will be no Pollyanna varnish. I promise you that. I'll bear my wounds and knuckle-headed inclinations, and I suspect you'll see some of your own cracks and wrinkles as I talk about mine. But even more, I'll pass on my discoveries, how I learned to get out of my own way, how to join in with the Holy Spirit, and how to inch and occasionally leap into transformation. In this story, you'll also see, I'm sure of it, the soft edges of a holy God inviting you always deeper as he has invited me. This is all good news because once you're there, you're on the road to healing and adventure, joining the company of the true greats, those made small by this humility and large through grace.
mm,
And at the head of this line of saints and fools is the great healer himself, Jesus, leading the stumbling caravan every step along the way.
That's all right, eh?
Hey, it's compelling, Bryan. It's
Yeah,
compelling because from
mhm,
the first pages, and I experienced this all the way through as I read the entire draft, you pull back the curtain and refuse to let us worship a facade
mm,
of what we think a leader should be. You refuse to make yourself more than you are.
mm,
And it's the courage to be so deeply vulnerable that allows us to find ourselves in the pages. Because I can relate to the wrinkles and the cracks. I can't relate to the varnish. So talk more about that writing process and how you continue to lean into vulnerability. And what was that like for you as you were writing?
yeah. It's almost as if I don't know any other way, like just because it feels like to pretend or like to parade around as if like I'm bulletproof or something like that. It just like it's like a foreign language to me, and that may feel in a weird way self-congratulatory, but I really mean it. Like I never have been able to relate to people that seem like everything is together.
Same,
I've struggled to
same.
that. I struggle with that, and it's not to say it's not their fault. It's just my own. Like I just don't. And so my writing reflects that. And I think that there's a type of kind of like showy vulnerability of like, look at me, almost like this big reveal. And I don't aim to do that at all. Because I think that that's almost it's almost in a weird way, and hopefully I can say it's almost pornographic in a way where it's like, this it's like that's not it's not a it's supposed to be like the language of wounded healer is obviously deeply connected to the Christian story and Henry Nouwen's phrase. But that's this idea of like when someone bears their scars, like you see that others have them as well, and that there's a way through wound towards scar. And I think like that's what humans need, and that's why we experience loneliness. You're answering your question, or that's why we experience loneliness when we don't have that. The question is about writing, and I think like there are times like where I mean, when you put yourself out there in that way, and then there's crickets. Like, oh my god, what a terrible feeling! Oh
My
my
word.
gosh,
The
yeah,
worst. The
it's
worst.
like, and then you get like this little bit of like that was so meaningful, and it's so easy for it to be like, well, I guess I'm great, and
It's like a
we
roller
go back,
coaster.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 and the Lord constantly is just like, hey, just why don't you just be comfortable being yourself and being comfortable being yourself in your writing and expressing, and just don't worry about like this, whether it's great, people think you're great or people think you're terrible. Just be yourself. Be comfortable being yourself. So the writing is an extension of who I am. In this, you'll see that if you attend Anchor. You'll see that if you go to Coffee with me. I'm definitely am not. I think probably if I err, I err. I probably should be more wise about and circumspect about what I should what I should withhold,
Sure.
and just because I just don't, I'm not thinking about like being discreet. I'm usually thinking about just sharing. Hey, this is what I've done.
Yeah. Which, I err on that side too and have such a deep admiration for leaders, especially who are willing to be brave and vulnerable. And in so many ways, it feels like a protection to me from the dangers of leadership. And you're really honest. I love your honesty throughout the book about your desire for approval, like your desire to be admired. And like, don't
Yes,
we all have that? We all have
totally.
that. Can we just be honest and name it? But I several times would be laying in bed reading the book and tell Corey, every leader needs to read this. Every leader within
Uh,
the church, yes, most definitely. And also anyone who has influence on other humans, which is,
mm,
I believe, all of us.
yeah,
But this layer of protection that comes when we are willing to be deeply honest with
yeah,
others. There is for me it feels like, okay, well, I better deal with my stuff then. If I'm
yeah,
committed
yeah.
to this kind of vulnerability, then that means that nothing's hidden, and I don't want anything to stay buried that's going to come out and bite me later. And so the question that kept coming up to me, because on some levels I did want a manual from you of like, okay, how did you do this, Bryan? How
Yeah,
do
yeah,
you
yeah.
live in that place as a leader? Because I know what I love
Mm.
about your writing is you're not just writing from this place of vulnerability. You are so deeply authentic. And I know this because I know you in real life. And I've heard your wife's version of the stories, right? Like, I know more than
Yes,
most people.
yeah,
You do share honestly here. And so
yeah.
my question is, how do you live with this level of authenticity and transparency as a leader in your actual life? Like, how do you practice this even outside of the writing?
Well, and there's a lot of ways to answer that question. I think I try to be myself in all the spaces, right? If you saw me in a one-on-one meeting with a staff member, if you saw me on the stage, if you saw me on a walk with a friend, you're probably going to see like the same person. Obviously, there's different like ways of presenting that are appropriate for certain spaces, but you're going to see like it's the same person. I think, but I think like how do I do that? Because I think like vulnerability can be exhausting. It's not like I'm like engaged in this constant one-upmanship of of like how much I've messed up. Like, well, I'm gonna be, but I'm always gonna be who I am, right? It's not like I'm always gonna be quote unquote vulnerable. I'm always who I am, and I think that you need to find some deep grounding bigger than your accomplishments and bigger than your good looks and your intelligence. It has to be bigger than your best, right? It has to be bigger than your best. And I think like so, Paul, when he opens up his letters, he says, "Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God." And for me, at some point, I mentioned this in the book, but for me, that became an actual helpful thing. Like these three anchor points, he has his identity, his name, his calling, his purpose, apostle. But then he grounds that in the one who calls him, who gives the calling and one who calls him. And when you try to live with your name and your purpose, oftentimes like you'll be cagier on vulnerability because it'll be like you'll be conscious of like wanting to promote and prove and push this idea of who you are because like it really in the end it depends on you. But when your identity and your purpose is grounded in the one who calls you, right? Then I think that there is this sense of like the pressure is so off and you can actually be vulnerable because the one who calls you is faithful, as Paul says. And so it really is freeing. Like it's like you do not have to carry the mantle of responsibility of kind of selling yourself. You can be comfortable in your own skin because it really isn't it's not you're not building your own foundation.
Yeah.
You're resting on a foundation that's already given to you. And so yeah, that's kind of been a refrain of like how I live from vulnerability is
Yeah.
recognizing.
Yeah. And I one of the things I so appreciate and admire about you, who you are as a pastor, as I've heard you over the years and watched you in real life, something that I appreciate is that your pursuit of God is deeper than platitudes. It's
Mm,
deeper than like it's easy to give pat biblical
yeah,
answers about,
yeah,
yes, the one who calls us is faithful. And so we
yeah,
build our firm foundation on the rock. And
yeah,
it's true. It's true. I can say those things and
yeah.
believe it. But what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like for you in your real life?
Yeah. Well, I think you those things become helpful when you recognize that you've jumped off the foundation. You've tried to start building on your little shaky thing again. I think like I have found myself like, and I would say when you know something about pain in some type of way, you aren't easily persuaded by those platitudes, right? So they have to be lived in. They cannot be these teaspoon a day will keep you from all the pain. It's like when you actually are in the pain, when you're in kind of painful moments, you find yourself, I guess, you need truth you can live in.
Mm,
And that's like the thing where shortcuts, how-tos, and life hacks, like it never feels lived like truth that's lived in, And that's where, I mean, I think that's where ultimately, like probably the one who calls us is faithful, like that is meaningful because it's about a lived in relationship with a holy God. The lessons are meaningful as they're connecting me with another person or with God. When it's about me just trying to integrate practical steps by myself apart from relationship, whether that's relationship with God or relationship, it just becomes something that is this exterior, lifeless thing. But that kind of three-part thing of Paul, it actually becomes incredibly profound when it becomes a prayed thing that I'm like, that's anchored to my own pain or my own experience and desperately reaching for the God that is providing it. Like that's when it becomes real. When it's just something that is varnish or topical, it has appearance of depth, but it actually, I don't know.
well, I'm hearing you say like we have to face our pain if we're going to have a grounded, lived in connection with the living
Yeah,
God.
yeah,
And I'm also aware of how much most of us don't want to experience or face pain. Like, no, thank you.
right. Yeah,
And yet, whether no matter where we are in our faith journey, whether we, believe in God or not, all of us long for more connection.
yeah,
And for those of us who want to know God, if there's
yeah,
if there's someone that's listening that's like, I want that kind of lived in faith. I want to know God more.
yeah,
And also I'm afraid of my pain. Like, what would
yeah.
you say to that person?
I think that, the doctor will say, where does it hurt? Right? Or sometimes the counselor will say, where does it hurt? And I think like you might say, where in your life is there something that is, whether it's the equivalent of a paper cut or like it feels like something much more painful. Like where is the particular thing? And I would say maybe what would it look like? What would it look like to kind of find healing there? I think it is scary to face it. I think that friends can be a major advantage to kind of just to talk with a friend, to uncover something with a friend. But I think that here's the thing: every time in the Gospels, when we see Jesus moves towards somebody with pain, he moves with healing. right? And so we are in whether we are come to this place where we settled the matter of God's existence or not, the God we see in Scripture, most clearly in the person of Jesus Christ, is one who moves towards pain with the hope and with the promise of healing, whether that's immediate or a long process. And so we can understand that and say that God's disposition towards me is one of some type of, in some way, healing. He wants to bring some type of restoration in me. And when I identify where there is this place of pain, I imagine myself seeing the face of Jesus, placing myself in the story where I'm the leper, or I'm the woman that's been suffering in one way or another. I'm the one who needs this touch. And I think that like there is this sacred space where you know the step you need to take towards some type of healing. And I think that we often live a lot of our life on this edge, on this step where we are afraid to take it, even though we know the right step. And I think that, like, knowing that Jesus is waiting for us, if we have any type of belief that Jesus is waiting for us and he is with us, and his disposition towards us is one of healing, I think that, like, whatever that step is, it is the way towards towards um, towards some type of healing journey. And I think that I've seen that. I mean, this whole book, my whole journey, has been one, I would say, repeated versions of that. My and in fact, in the second chapter, if you'll permit me, um, the title is, I don't know if it was in the original one, but the title is Love's Intervention. I don't know if you,
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah. And so if you think about the intervention, you took your friend or your family member to come over and you confront them about the pain that they're causing themselves and the pain that they're causing other people by not dealing with this thing.
Yeah.
And I think that, and interventions are difficult because you cannot force a person to really own it, right? But I think that if you imagine, like, what if all of our moments in our life of great growth were about God's loving intervention in our life. That he actually is similar to friends and family members surrounding us with pointing to the don't when you do this, you hurt us, you hurt yourself. Step towards health and healing. What if God's moment of transformation was about just God moving close and saying, would you see that this pain you're causing yourself? Like, I just want to remove it from you. Let's walk together towards healing. That's kind of been a helpful metaphor for me, that that love of love's intervention. So
That's so beautiful. And there are a couple things that strike me as you're sharing that vision of Jesus really inviting us into greater and greater healing, which is hard for us to picture if we've never experienced it, right? Like it's
yeah,
hard for us to
yeah,
believe that that's actually
yeah,
possible.
yeah,
But one is this understanding and belief that the posture of God toward us is actually one of kindness and care and gentleness and goodness. And I don't know that all of us believe that or understand fully that God's heart toward us is kind and gentle.
yeah,
Um, and so I love that you're uh, just innate in what you're describing about that healing process is the goodness of God.
yeah,
The kindness of God is inviting us gently, not forcing or hitting us over the head. It's not like a blindside intervention where, like, I think about that
yeah,
scenario where you have family
yeah,
members
yeah,
who you're like feeling betrayed. I mean, I imagine I've
yeah,
never had an intervention, but where you might feel betrayed or like
yeah.
blindsided. That's not how God works.
That's good.
He's so gentle. And then the other
Hmm.
piece of that you mentioned briefly earlier is, and you talked about this in the book too, picturing the people who have loved you best surrounding you and being a part of that journey with you, with Jesus. So this assumption that we're not doing any of this work of pursuing healing or even experiencing the nearness of God completely in isolation, right? We're
Yeah,
doing this in community with others. So I'm wondering if you would talk about that a little bit of like what's been the role of relationships and community in your life and understanding the healing and the
yeah,
intimacy that God wants for you.
yeah. Well, I think it's been through friendship, really, and I think that friendships can go as far as there is time and candor. I think time and candor allow friendships to go as far as possible as they can. And I think there was one particular mentor in my life that that God used in a significant way. And like the funny thing is like when you look at like what the actual, what did they do? Was there some new truth that they shared? Did they tell you about, some insight from some counseling, journal that just came out, or did they tell you about a new vitamin, or like what did they do that was so helpful? It's like, well, they listened. um, and here's the thing is that like this mentor, he would pray for me, and he would always end his prayers by saying, "I just thank you for this awesome, awesome friend of mine, this dear, awesome, awesome friend." And I knew I wasn't awesome. I had the evidence, but he thought I was awesome. He tricked me into believing I was.
He
Like,
tricked you.
yeah, I mean, in the most loving, and obviously in a kind of a joking way, but it was this process of him getting close enough for me to feel comfortable, for me to share, and then for him to continue to share this refrain of awesome. And I think I look back on that, and he never actually was hard with me. Like, I would confess things, I would say, "This is what I'm struggling with," but he would say, "Oh, my dear friend, my awesome," like that was his response when and so, and I think we do need people that will kind of sometimes be like, "Bryan, I just need to tell you." And there are people and
Hmm.
there's roles that has to happen, but it's also equally important for us to have people where they just say, they meet us with our confession. They meet our confession with, "My dear awesome friend." And I think we need voices like that will
Yeah.
be unilaterally kind, like just that's what they bring.
Yeah.
And I think that was, God used him to bring me to a place of deeper comfort in my own skin, deeper depth in my relationship with God. Others, I mean, I think of too, like I was pretty compulsively. I was the guy that would call incessantly. Hey, hey, hey! Wait, like girlfriends would break up with me because I just was so compulsive. And there's reasons for that in my own story. But I remember in college, a mentor, like I was new to faith, and God had transformed my life in significant ways, but this compulsivity was still there. So I would call him like 5 or 6 times, and like, "Hey, hey, hey, what are you doing? What are you, and you didn't pick up, and like, man." Then what he did was so fascinating. Was that it was the first time that I had a friend that did this, was that he never rushed to call me back quickly, and he also never froze or ghosted me because of my weird compulsivity. He just was like, he would retain his boundaries and reach out when he had time. And I think like those are two things that I was like, he modeled, like him actually not calling me back quick and him not ghosting me was just a picture of God's stability and God's like his willingness to kind of just like meet me when I needed, where I needed. And I mean, those are just like very simple things that two people did in my life that
Hmm.
God used to help and move me towards healing, and that kind of
Yeah.
in that theme of intervention, like
Hmm.
intervening in areas of my insecurity, my own compulsivity, to bring me towards a deeper level of wholeness
Hmm.
and healing. And it's simple stuff that we can offer each other, but that simple stuff is powerful. It's like speaker wire. How does this bass line come out of this thin speaker wire? Well, it does. And it's through the normal offices of friendship where God offers most of the healing that he does.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you said that because that's been so deeply my experience is learning to experience the kindness of God and the persistent love of God, the stability of God toward me in the people in my life that give me faces and eyes I can imagine when I am, struggling in my imagination to picture God with me. I can picture kind faces. And I know you talked about that in the book too, and how much he is in, if we talk about the Holy Spirit living within us, he literally is in those who know him and love him to
Yeah.
be the hands and feet of Jesus in my life.
Yes.
And
Yes.
also he helps me understand who he is more as I practice receiving love vulnerably through, that candor that you mentioned with other people. And so, yeah, I just love this conversation, Bryan. And I'm wondering, as
Mm.
we're kind of wrapping up here,
Yeah.
is there a permission slip that you would want to give people?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it is really, it's that your relationships will be limited by the limit it reaches, the limit where it finds its limit is where we cannot be honest with each other. And I think that vulnerability, by the way, it means to put yourself in a place where you could be wounded. Right? So, and we can go into places with vulnerability when we know we're ultimately protected. But every relationship will stop where we are not willing to be honest. Now, there are some places where it's like this particular honesty in this particular place is not actually appropriate. That's just not the space
Hmm.
for it. But there are some relationships, some friendships, certainly a marital relationship, family relationships, where like I'm thinking of a father and a son, right? Oftentimes the limits on that depth of relationship is around the father being frozen and not knowing how to be himself before the son. And so the son doesn't know how to be himself before the world. And so I think that like where are the spaces? The permission slip is find the spaces, find those relationships where honesty will grow it and actually be a tidal wave of healing in that person's life that will go extend beyond them into other people. And just the permission slip would be honest in those places, be vulnerable in those places, and give yourself permission to be vulnerable, knowing that you may be wounded, but you're ultimately protected. So you're going to be okay.
That's beautiful. I could not ask for a better description of the power and beauty and invitation toward vulnerability. So thank you for that. And tell us about the book. Where can we find it? When can we get
Yeah,
it?
yeah. Well, it's going to be live on Amazon April 1st, so you can get it there. We do have it'll be Audible print. The ebook's coming out on March 19th, so you can get that quicker. But yeah, so it'll be there. You can follow me on Instagram if you want to see all the little updates and all that kind of stuff.
Awesome. And I'll link all your stuff in the show notes too, so people can just click and follow you. Bryan, this has been such a delight. Thank you for joining me and for the gift of your vulnerability here and in your life and the ways that our friendship has shaped and formed both me and Corey. It's just a gift to be your friend.
Yeah, makes it an honor to be here.
Thanks for joining me on this episode of Permission Slips. I hope this conversation gives you permission to pursue greater vulnerability and connection in your relationships and to find even just a couple places where you can be more fully yourself. Your life matters, and so does your vulnerability, more than you know.